Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we're on the ancestral homeland of the Occoquan people, so Gunash Chi Shat Yi Adi. Welcome to this ancestral home of the Occoquan. And before we get started, and before I introduce our speaker for the evening, I'll just give you a quick heads up about upcoming Evening at Egan events. On Friday the 25th, we have Dr. Robin Walls, a professor of history, longtime professor here at UAS, who's going to be talking about his current book project. The title of his talk is The French Avengers, and he just came back not long ago from time in France working on this project, and he's going to be talking about his forthcoming book called Shady Detectives, Elegant Criminals, and Dark Avengers, Popular French Heroes from 1815 to 1950. So I encourage you to join us for that. And on Friday, November 1st, we have Professor Saul Neely, a UAS Associate Professor of English, who's giving a talk called Indigenous Cosmopolitanism, Being Cherokee in the Raven Bioregion. So I encourage all of you to join us for these upcoming events. And Saul Neely's talk is the first in November, which is Native American Heritage Month, and we'll be having a number of presentations during November that are associated with that theme. So it's a privilege for me to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Sanjay Pyare, who's an associate professor of environmental science here at UAS in our UAS School of Arts and Sciences. Sanjay's been a faculty member here since 2005, and the title of his talk tonight is Sumatra to Southeast Alaska, What the Journey of a Migratory Seabird Can Teach Us. And the focus of his talk is around his research conducted on a 5-month Fulbright scholar undertaking in Indonesia, focusing on the Aleutian Turn. Sanjay's educational and research background include a PhD in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology from the University of Nevada, Reno, and a bachelor degree in biology from Hartwick College in New York. He has research interest in GIS-supported landscape assessments, ground truthing GIS and remotely sensed resources, landscape connectivity, habitat modeling, animal disbursement and movement, and aquatic, terrestrial, and marine interaction. So I think we'll see much of that interest reflected in his presentation tonight. And I'll just make a quick note about the U.S.Fulbright Scholar Program. It's one of the most widely recognized and prestigious international exchange programs in the world. It grants support for graduate study and research in over 140 countries. The program's goal is to improve intercultural relations, cultural diplomacy, and intercultural competence between people of the United States and other countries through exchange of persons, knowledge, and skills. It is one of the most prestigious and competitive scholarship programs in the world. So I think it's a real testament to Sanjay's educational interests and his research interests that he was awarded this opportunity to be a U.S.Fulbright scholar. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sanjay Pyare.
So before I begin, you might see me glance down at my phone here, and it's not because I'm trying to, be rude or anything. It's because I sent a message to a number of Indonesians, a number of my Indonesian colleagues, my colleagues from the university, from Udayana University, AMNF, which is the American Indonesian Exchange Foundation, and so they're out there right now, and they're listening, and I really just wanted to kind of acknowledge them. It's 10 a.m. on Saturday, tomorrow there, right? And I'm already getting messages here, so they're giving me the thumbs up in the Indonesian way. And so I really wanted to thank everyone there, the staff, the faculty, people I met who hosted me there for 5 months. Just thank you for making the world a much smaller place. And sampai jumpa lagi, which is see you soon in Indonesia. So I'll talk a little more about my Indonesian colleagues. So to segue a little bit in terms of the Fulbright, I think it's real important that we recognize the Fulbright Foundation and what it does. It sort of underpins my talk in more ways than I realized when I first started this. As this quote from William Fulbright says, basically, it's about friendship, and it's about compassion, it's about peace, and it's about a little more reason. Wow. Could you imagine? In this day and age, a senator like going online and saying, yeah, we're gonna do this. Not because it makes any political sense to do this, just because in the hope that in the long term, that, you know, our kids can live in peace. I mean, like, what an amazing thing. Could you imagine if like we had a program like that in Alaska, like a statewide program, right? Where anybody like you could apply for 6 months to punch out of the rat race. We'll be accepting applications soon, right? And you could go around, you know, to Alaska and just share your expertise and do nothing but cross bridges, make friends, just in the hopes that, you know, you can reconcile differences and just understand each other. Like, what a noble cause. So to me, this is kind of a big thing. I guess that's all I'm going to say about that right now. But it sort of it underpins my talk to some degree, because I titled my talk what this seabird can teach us. This talk isn't really about research per se. It is about research, and I'll talk about more of that. And I'm going to do more of a sciencey talk actually next month for the Audubon Society if you want to see that. But I kind of want to bring out some of the lessons that I learned. I sort of have like a little bit of PTSD for my Fulbright. I call that post-turn stress or post-travel stress syndrome. And it's like I'm still trying to reconcile what actually happened those 5 months, because it was a little personal. It gave me some perspective about what I have been doing and my outlook and how small of a bubble I've actually been in. And so I think that's a testament to what the Fulbright really is. But first, we need to do a little language lesson. Okay, so mas bro, you can repeat, go ahead. Mas bro. So that means what's up, bros, right? In Bahasa Indonesia. And that's really funny, and that's uniquely Indonesian, and it's funny Indonesian, but it's so classic because it actually translates to bro, right? Like man, bro, you know, and that's a like classic Indonesian. And it's been twisted so that if you want to say the same thing to ladies, you actually say umbak, bro. Go ahead. Which is like, what's up, sis bros? Or you can say umbak, sis. So I thought that was always funny. But actually the appropriate way, you know, and that's not really slang, people do say it, but would be salamat malam, which is good evening. And you know, and the appropriate way to greet somebody, and really pretty much anywhere, is apa kabar. And you would respond with baik saja. Right. All right, you've done well. So my favorite quote, though, was, you know, because I brought my kids there. They were 8 and 10 years old, so we had to watch, you know, the Lego movie in Bahasa Indonesia several times. So it was funny listening to this, but everything is awesome. Semua hebat. Right, and when I said that, that was pretty funny because people just laughed. I'm not sure if that's actually the literal translation, but it made people laugh, so, you know. I think they knew the movie, so. So let's talk a little about Alaska and Indonesia. So this is kind of a nice comparison of the archipelago superimposed on the map of Alaska to basically scale, kind of giving you a sense of you know, its extent and its orientation. A quick geography quiz: what's bigger, Indonesia or Alaska? Any guesses? It's actually, it's fairly close, so it's a tough one. It's Indonesia, 1.9 million kilometers squared versus 1.7 million kilometers squared for Alaska anyway. Okay, what has more islands, Indonesia or Alaska? I hear Indonesia. Yeah, you got it right. 17,000 islands in Indonesia, 3,000 in Alaska, just to give you a sense. And Alaska is kind of a heavyweight for islands, so that's massive, right? What is the longest coastline, Alaska or Indonesia? Here, Indonesia. It's actually, in a twisted way, I don't know if I believe the numbers. I should. I'm a geographer, but it's actually Alaska. Alaska has 76,000 kilometers squared, or rather kilometers of coastline compared to 54,000 total. So we have a lot of tidal lands and lots of, because of our tidal differences, I think that creates sort of a lot of variability in our coastline. So that's probably what that's about. Okay, who has more people, Indonesia or the US? Well, you thought I was going to say Alaska, weren't you, right? That's too easy. Actually, the US. The US is 375 million people, and Indonesia has 240 million people. So, I think that's sort of like a common thing to think about Asia and whatnot. Of course, population density is very high in Indonesia. It's sort of almost double or triple what it is in the United States. But so that's fun. A little more about Indonesia and Alaska, and where I was. So I spent time in Bali, which I refer to as sort of like, living in Disneyland to some degree, as I was telling Rick, at some level, because it accommodates a lot of tourism. And I was on the island of Bali, and in some ways, I found parallels to Juneau. I gave the same talk to Indonesians, basically, and would have put up the same slide, and would basically say, well, guess what? Juneau is actually the Bali of Alaska in a lot of ways. I know you guys may think differently, but one of the Juneau kind of stands out from the rest of Alaska, and Bali actually does too. Bali is actually, it's predominantly Hindu in a country of 200 million Muslims and Christians. It's about 90% Muslim. People don't realize that. It's a very progressive Muslim country, so you don't hear about that in the news too much. But and it's a pretty spectacular landscape, kind of like Juneau. And even more importantly, the reason why I think it's relevant and why it brings to mind sort of Juneau is there's 4 million people in Bali, the island of Bali, and they get close to 12, 13 million visitors a year. We get what are we up to, 1.3 million for our community of 35,000. So, so that dynamic of sort of, small isolated places and getting lots of people, and it's sort of like, so they're very accommodating. We're all very accommodating, I think, for the most part, and Balinese are also very accommodating. So, so there's certainly some parallels there. What are some other parallels between these places? Particularly between, Indonesia and, this is a little broad, but it just illustrates this idea that things are very connected these days. I'm not just saying that sort of very, in a very superficial way, that it's all globalized, but things are really connected, in ways we didn't realize. In research, we call this, when social and environmental systems are coupled over big spaces, we call that, there's a term for that, and that's a telecoupling. And so a good example of that is, it's been in the news recently, is deforestation, of course, and oil palm plantations that are everywhere. And there's been a lot of things said and a lot of sensationalized things about deforestation in Indonesia. But what's really, to some degree, what's driving that and deforestation is the demand for tropical hardwoods, which in fact do end up in Fred Meyer. Here, I've actually looked at that. So some of that furniture that we all buy is actually, some of that's Indonesian hardwood. A lot of that's going to Europe and Asia. But these days, what's driving that even more is this massive demand for oil or biostock for biofuels. So actually, there's not much money in timber. There's actually a lot more money in putting a oil palm plantation in, reaping the oil, and then refining it and sending it overseas. And most of that actually goes, in some ironic way, it goes to Europe because Europe is a leader in biofuel. They're trying to get off diesel, and they've been substituting almost 50% of their diesel fuels on biofuels. So, wow. So we have this weird connection between this environmentally minded Parisian who's driving their car, right? And unwittingly, they're driving in some ways, not really driving, but there's this connection to Indonesia that's really connecting these, the average logger in remote Sumatra and what their livelihood is. And so there's some tension there. And the point here is that I'm not gonna argue either side of that. I just think it's a pretty fascinating thing that, our environmental decisions are really, they're complex. And they're interwoven. They're not always straightforward, and there's a lot of back and forth associated with that. And a lot of that's, you don't hear about all of that. You hear about the deforestation parts, but a lot of these issues are complex, as I said. Another great connection between, in particular, between Alaska and Indonesia. There's a couple of them. This is kind of another idea of, I guess, scientists like this word teleconnections, telecouplings. It's not actually referring to anything too weird like telekinesis or any of that stuff. That's just tele referring to sort of over large distances, some kind of phenomena. And so there's atmospheric coupling that actually occurs. And this diagram shows, this is a classic form of atmospheric coupling that actually drives a lot of the atmospheric currents associated with what we see here, a lot of the winds. So you have low pressure systems that actually originate in Australasia that interact with other atmospheric drivers and end up driving a lot of our weather. So telecoupling, is actually one of the things that we're studying now to try and understand this relationship between our weather patterns and what's going on in these other areas, such as Indonesia, has everything to do with our weather patterns. Another great example of that is looking at ocean currents. So in the bottom there is what's called the Kuroshio current in the bottom sort of left there. And what you get is tropical water that comes up from Indonesia off these coral reef systems that's driven up and ends up kind of hitting just between this south of Japan, and does this dog leg where it meets with cold water that comes from the Arctic. And guess where that water shoots to? Shoots straight across. You can see that. Goes all the way from just south of Japan all the way to kind of where about Cape Yakutat is, if you know where that is, like just a little north of Yakutat, and sort of delivers this warm water current. So that water can be upwards of about 70 degrees sometimes, not by the time it gets to Alaska, but it's just, again, this really interesting illustration of how parts of the tropics are really connected to us. There's other interesting parallels. Alaska and Indonesia are, because of their coastline, upper left is Indonesia, bottom right is Alaska. We're unwittingly the recipients of plastics and marine debris. Again, this is kind of a complex issue. This has been sensationalized too. Actually in Bali, it's a huge issue, and people are getting a lot of grief, but a lot of people are looking at each other going, where is this coming from? Because it's not necessarily just local. A lot of it is being driven by tourism locally and how to handle it, but there's just, a lot of this is coming from other places. And the marine debris in Alaska points to the same thing. A lot of it's not being generated locally. A lot of that comes from East Asia to some degree, and from North America. It's just caught up in the gyre and ends up on our beaches. So we're dealing with similar things, even though we're in different places. I'm going to shift to birds a little bit, and why studying birds are important. Birds on the coastal margin in particular. So these are birds, these are birds that are inland, maybe, birds that are found in wetlands, birds that are found wading, birds that are maybe just offshore, like Aleutian Turns, seabirds, and then more sort of classic pelagic birds that are found further offshore. But all those birds, if you sort of total them up, right, and you evaluate where these birds occur, it's no secret that their occurrence has everything to do with the health of these mixing zones and these estuaries and the services that we get from these estuaries. So our socioeconomic systems, or our socioeconomic value, whether it's fish, whether it's recreation, whether it's mariculture, whether it's all these things that we find right at the coastal margin, whether it's sport fishing, all those are related to the health of those coastal systems, and so the productivity of those coastal systems is driving the occurrence of these birds. And so where you have these birds, you have relatively good systems. And that's one of the classic examples of birds or species as indicators of ecological health. It's actually one of the better examples. There's a lot of debate about this idea of indicator species, but pretty much everybody buys this because it really makes sense, and it's been shown over and over. So there's a really good reason to focus on seabirds and birds right on the coastal margin in general. Here in Alaska, there's another really good reason that's emerging. And this is a bit sensationalized, but at some level, so we want to be careful, but it's kind of alarming in that the last 5 years, we've had massive die-offs of seabirds, everything from common murres to several other species. And it's not just restricted to one species, but the common murres have been the one that's been in the news. And we have like die-offs in 1 year, we have got like events, as you see from this figure in the bottom left, die-offs that are numbers in 7,000 birds all in one shot, just dead. And the predominant cause is starvation. And so that's a bit of a smoking gun in terms of the ecological health of our marine food webs is the conventional thinking, but there might be other things that are at work here. So I think that's just basically saying our marine food webs to some degree are in trouble. There could be there's some debate right now about how that is, because there could be some toxins, shellfish poisoning, right? That same toxin that's associated with that and algal blooms is one thing that's been invoked. But it's pretty clear that this is kind of an emerging issue. It's not uncommon for seabirds to die and to have some sort of mass death. That has been recorded through history, but the extent of it is all across southwestern Alaska, less so southeast Alaska and western Alaska. And this is also where we're looking, right? Alaska's a big coastline, so these are areas where they've been found. And the extent of it, and it's been happening for 5 years continuously. It hasn't necessarily gotten better from what I understand, but maybe there's someone else out here who knows a little better. But so that's a little alarming, and that's all the more reason to focus on the species that we have, and in particular, and this is the theme, is the species that we still have around. And we should be asking questions about why aren't they being affected, and what can we do to kind of study and understand that. Seabirds are flagships for marine conservation and coastal conservation at large. That was one of the things I tried to promote when I was in Indonesia. And I tried to sort of espouse that a lot, there's this indeterminable value that exists in Indonesia in terms of their coastal systems, and it's unrecognized. And one way to sort of get at that is to think about these seabirds as really kind of demonstrating that value that still exists in places like Indonesia. So a little bit about Aleutian Turns. So Aleutian Turns is the focus of some research I started with several collaborators, and I really need to thank, I was a small part, and I am a small part of this research project here in Alaska. There's collaborators from Fish and Game here locally, the Forest Service, and now Oregon State University, the Fish and Wildlife Service. Several people several agencies have also contributed to this. So I wanted to thank them. So what do we know about Aleutian Turns? Well, the bird is primarily a seabird, but meaning it's found offshore, but not very far offshore. But it nests colonially onshore during certain times of the year. It basically shows up sometime around mid-April and departs sometime around early August, late July. And it goes to places like this on the bottom, which is Black Sand Spit up in Yakutat. If any of you know that, you know that on the left there, sort of the freshwater mixing zone, that's the Seatuck Estuary. That's one of the most productive estuaries in all of Alaska. So to me, it's no I'm not surprised at all that Aleutian Turns showed up there at all, because it has all 5 species of salmon, it has steelhead, it is, it's just known, it has a subsistence fishery that probably has been in operation for, I don't know, a few thousand years, that still continues to today, so, and it still continues to be very productive, so we know that Aleutian Turns, in terms of, I guess one thing I didn't also say is that, coincident with all of these die-offs, and this has been out there in the news as well, about 60% of seabird populations around the globe, we know are just no longer in the numbers they have been. So that's not, I guess, that's sort of similar to what we've been hearing for several other groups of species, whether they're amphibians or birds at large. But so we know at large that seabirds are to some degree in trouble. So what about Aleutian Turns? Aleutian Turns, what we know about them is we did a study about 2-3 years ago, and we know that about 90% of the colonies are facing some sort of decline, but the information we have is not very, I would say it's not great information, right? So we don't have a great historical information on numbers of Aleutian Turns. But we know that where we do have them, where we do have numbers, that the numbers have declined, and we're pretty sure that we've seen we could say about half the numbers that we've seen historically now are actually breeding in colonies distributed throughout Alaska. One of the more alarming things, though, is that we've seen some of the largest colonies kind of blink out and basically persist. So these are colonies that you wouldn't necessarily think should be blinking out. This is colonies in Kodiak Island and colonies in the Copper River Delta, which if you know either of those places, those are the heavyweights for salmon, right? Those doesn't get any bigger than that other than maybe Bristol Bay. And so those are really, really productive systems, and we wouldn't expect birds to be blinking out there. But those colonies were a few thousand birds. They are now in the hundreds to less than 100, some years gone entirely. So the one year I did a survey in the Copper River Delta, and we found 1-2 birds flying around. And the birds haven't come back. So we don't know why that is the case either. So there's some anecdotal evidence that, more than anecdotal evidence, we know we've had big numbers of birds in some places blink out, but other places we're not really so sure. But we know that in Yakutat, actually, one of the oldest and best records around the state, we know that there's been about 1,500 birds, between 750 and 1,500 birds, almost upwards of 2,000, somewhere in that, I don't want to say 1 to 2,000 range. And that was a number that was surveyed about last year. And some years we haven't always seen that, but there still kind of seems to be about the same numbers of birds year in, year out in Alaska, but a lot of noise around that. Plus or minus, some big noise, like plus or minus 500 birds, though we still don't know what's exactly going on there. But it seems to say, it says that these birds are, at least Yakutat, still has a fairly decent colony. So the birds show up in Alaska, or show up in places like Yakutat in April. And there's a question about why they show up to Alaska, or why they show up to places like Yakutat. I alluded to the Seabird River estuary. Evolutionarily speaking, the reason why these birds migrate are for resources, to optimize resources. It's kind of a game from an evolutionary standpoint. From an evolution standpoint, the payoff is so big for these birds to migrate to the Seabird River estuary and to raise their young. More than it takes all the energy to expend. To do that travel, to raise their young and to return, but that it just pays to migrate. And these birds adapt to these areas. But it's interesting because it's not always clear what direction migration happens. Traditionally, the thinking is that where birds originally, where their colonies are, they sort of started to overwinter or evolved to overwinter in other places. But other people have now shown that's not actually the case. Some birds have actually evolved the reverse, where they've actually started migrating to places like Alaska. For Aleutian Turns, we're not actually sure. But they're coming here to breed, and they're coming here to optimize resources and travel 10,000 miles round trip and take their 6 to 8 week old fledgling back. as well. So obviously the energetic expenditure also to return is really important, or rather the energetic expenditure is not so high that, that it actually, they're actually to go back to a place like Indonesia, and that place is so productive as well. That's what the theory is that, they're able to continue to exhibit these migratory cycles. One of the interesting things that continues to be puzzling about Aleutian Turns, though, is that I'm pretty sure about this. I'm not sure my colleagues are. Well, I'm not so sure, but I'm not sure we're looking at the same birds every year. My thinking is that we're looking at different cohorts of birds that are moving through, which is really unusual for terns. Terns are notorious for migrating, like Arctic terns. They will migrate. They do something even crazier. They go to Antarctica, and they go sort of north-south and come back, actually, and they also breed on black sand spit, and they will come back to this spot, that same spot. They'll come back to that same exact spot year in, year out. Maybe that's a little bit of exaggeration, but they're notorious for that, and terns in general really have a high degree of fidelity. Aleutian terns, not so clear. We know that, I'll talk a little more about what we found out when we started tagging these birds. And then one other thing, I'm maybe spending too much time on this, but just want to give you some background, is that these terns, we have seen fledglings and eggs in a place like black sand spit, in some years, but most years we haven't. So even though they're migrating to places like black sand spit and breeding and making nests, it's really rare for us to see eggs that hatch and then fledglings emerge, and for us to see fledglings a few weeks later. Half the number of years, we've been studying them for about 12 years now, the colony is completely abandoned. So we do a survey in Yakutat. I come back to Juneau on Friday, and by Monday, my colleagues in Yakutat say there's nothing there at the colony, which should be about the peak of fledging and whatnot. So there's definitely something that's not right there. So we're not sure why these birds are abandoning nesting mid-season. That's not always the case. Last year was probably the best year and what we've seen in a long time in terms of seeing young on the ground and fledglings. So again, more mystery, Aleutian Turns. So what did we do for this, for my Fulbright research? Well, this isn't really just my Fulbright research. So we started getting really interested in the migration behavior of this since we knew virtually nothing. There were some anecdotal reports of Aleutian Turns in Asia, but because there's also some Aleutian Turns in Siberia, in coastal Siberia as well, about double the number that are in Alaska, we weren't sure really what to make of that. Oh, and I totally spaced over that. One thing is that I forgot to say is that we've got about 5,000, 7,000 birds in Alaska right now. Historically, maybe 15,000 as far as we know. So there have never been many birds here. 15,000 birds over, half a century or a century, that's not many birds. I mean, Arctic terns, just in Alaska, there's probably 1.5 million birds, so that's common for seabirds. So just right off the bat, a creature, or a species with 15,000 individuals is kind of something to be a little concerned about. And that may be just how it is for Aleutian terns and how it always was. There's also, as I said, another population in Siberia, about double that. We don't know how North American and Siberian populations relate. I'll talk a little about that. But in 2007, we started, or 2007, is that right? 2010, we started migration tracking using a couple of different techniques. I'll talk a little about this. But the focus of my Fulbright research was really to take some of that tracking data and basically I wrote my Fulbright to chase terns to Indonesia because no one had ever actually done this yet. I'll show you some maps. And so I used those maps, those migration maps, as a basis to visit some of these sites on the ground. And then to really ask questions, not so much about what these birds are exactly doing there, but what do these areas look like? What's going on in these areas? What are the human dimensions and the social dimensions associated with the areas that Aleutian terns are going to? So that was a real motivation. And then the other motivation was to really, that's not up here, that I learned quickly was it really needed to focus on outreach, just doing a lot more sort of on the ground, telling the story about the Aleutian Turn as I discovered. We capture terns on the left there. It's pretty simple. It's the old box trap technique, right on the nest. And you pull a string, just about. We fit them with two different kinds of transmitters. On the sort of the second from the left there is a geolocator. It's a relatively simple tracking device. And on the next sort of picture over is a satellite transmitter, a backpack satellite transmitter. So there's a major problem or a major challenge trying to do this, trying to track birds like this. The reason why we don't have good information on birds of this size is this is only a 100-gram bird. You need a transmitter that's about 3 grams and less, 3% of the body weight. So that's not very much at all, right? That's, like, I don't know, less than a penny, so really it needs to be a lightweight transmitter. There's a lot of constraints, associated with this. Geolocators, how do they work? Geolocators are actually pretty fascinating. They're not very sophisticated. They're not GPSs in any way. They simply can record your location using light. So they're basically a light meter and a clock. And so my analogy is, if you've ever heard of a sextant that was used historically for maritime navigation, it's kind of a digital sextant. So you can determine longitude, or rather latitude, right, based on day length. So if I told you on June 20th, right, that wherever you were or wherever I was experiencing 22 hours of daylight, right? Where would I be? It's pretty clear that, I'd be probably, somewhere up north, right, on a certain date, wherever, because of the length of day, right? So we know that there's this relationship between latitude in particular and a certain time of year. If you can measure light at different locations around the globe, right, and you know how much light is hitting, these different areas, then you can sort of cross-reference, how much light is actually measured on these birds relative to, where light should be or how much light there should be. You kind of get the idea. There's sort of so there's, of course, lots of ways to relate these. There's lots of models of how much light, should be at any one place at any one time, or rather, day length in particular. For longitude, it's a little trickier, but basically it's using the same kind of idea, but instead of using day length, it's actually the actual timing of when that light is measured and when it turns off. So for instance, if I bought you a ticket and told you to go anywhere in the world, and we synchronized our clocks, right, before you left, and just told you to get on a plane and go, and you went to some mysterious location, and I called you and said, okay, when did the sun come up? Wherever you were, right? And you told me when the sun came up, and also told me when the sun went down, when you were drinking Mai Tais, wherever you went. I would be able to deduce, right, about where you were based on what relative time the sun was supposed to come up and when it was supposed to set. So it's basically kind of, again, cross-referencing the timing of sun up and sundown, and actually not just sun up, sundown, but what we call solar noon should be relative to some common timing system. So you can figure out these things, and you can put these transmitters on, and the trick is you have to catch the birds again to get them back. So we put about 110 of these out. I'll talk more about how many we actually found. We've only found about 12 since, in about 8 years. We actually still found 2 more last year, so that started in 2010. They still continue to trickle in slowly. The most we've ever number of migration cycles we've gotten out of these has been 3. So we've gotten 3 complete cycles out of any one of these tags, back and forth between here and ultimately Indonesia. These satellite tags we started to use with a collaborator, Don Lyons from Oregon State, and these are pretty nifty. These use a kind of an old technology, a technology that's been around for a while. It's Argos technology or Doppler technology, Doppler is like, For those of you that sort of haven't heard of that before, it's that phenomena where, like, right, if there was an ambulance driving by, God forbid, UAS right now, on the highway, that inflection of the siren, right, that sort of woo, right, that you hear when a police car or something comes by. So that's the frequency. That's a frequency change that relates to our distance to that siren that's causing that. So these satellite transmitters are actually little solar-powered backpacks. There's no battery in them at all, really, and that's the key, because the batteries for any of these tracking devices is always the constraint, because you need to power these in some way. So this is solar-powered. It's a little backpack, and it just emits a known signal. And satellites, Argos satellites, will basically, a number of them will try when a bird passes underneath it. Or when an object with one of these Argos tracking devices travels underneath it, is able to pick up on that inflection. So there's many different satellites, and you're able to do some kind of triangulation. Geolocators, this is just like an illustration of the tracking technology. Geolocators aren't very accurate. There's kind of a relative size. These individual points are bird locations, actually, in I don't know if is there a pointer here at all? Oh, right. There you go. Is that showing up? No, it's not actually showing up. That's okay. That's Taiwan over here on the sort of that island right there. That's Japan. But that's kind of showing you the distribution of the locations using the two different technologies. It's not showing you, it's not saying that one is any more. The red locations are from the geolocators we put out in the beginning of the project, and so those birds actually migrated through Taiwan. The birds with the new tags, these satellite tracking devices, they migrated predominantly along the East Asia flyway. I'll talk a little more about that, but the size of those dots kind of give you a sense, and the distribution give you a sense of how those two different technologies kind of give you a different sort of level of accuracy and what the trade-off is. These satellite transmitters, unfortunately, only last about like 5 months before the birds shed them. So trying to race to Indonesia to try and find one of these birds with the tracking devices wasn't really entirely possible, but I was close. Okay, so what do we find? For the migration route, basically the birds left late July, and they kind of raced across Alaska. So they took about 10 days to basically leave. Once they started migrating, they move quickly, and they migrate out of the Eastern Hemisphere. They waste no time, and they're largely pelagic, and they mostly sort of follow the arc of the Aleutians. A few of them kind of fly pelagically or along the open ocean, but they kind of meet somewhere around the Western Aleutians. If you ever heard of Annette Island, somewhere around there on the Aleutians? They tend to follow, congregate around there and then keep heading west. They get to the Eastern Hemisphere sometime around early August or so, mid-August. And they move about 450, 500 kilometers a day during that time. So they touch down in about the Sea of Japan, which is that, this is a figure actually from a publication we did, that F right there. That's kind of the first place where they tend to congregate. That's known as a stopover. And we don't know that because from any of the information per se that these tracking devices are providing to us, but we know that because their movements start to really slow and they start sort of doing localized movements, and we know they're spending more time in that particular area. We can actually see that in the tracking data. So they work their way down along the East Asian coastline and get to about Taiwan or the Luzon Strait, which separates sort of China and Taiwan there. I'll talk about that a little bit. Work their way down into Philippines, and then when they get to the Philippines, they kind of fan out and disperse across the entire archipelago. So they do this whole thing, actually crossing the water is pretty quick, about 2 weeks, 10 days, but then when they hit the Sea of Japan on down, they kind of take their sweet time, working their way down until they get to their wintering grounds in Indonesia. And so this is kind of the current state of what we understand for where Aleutian Turns went across all the different tracking devices we had. What do I want to say about this? So I said they got there about third week of September, so they just got there relatively recently. And they stay there for about 6 months until about mid-March. It's kind of remarkable to me when this is all, when you look at this map, because first of all, this is about 3,500 miles spread between Sumatra, the tip of Sumatra, all the way to New Britain Island, which is off the coast of Papua New Guinea. We've had a few birds. Actually, there's a bird right now who actually is there, and again, a different bird. And the more tracking devices we put out there through the years, we've got about 4 or 5 years worth of a variety of tracking devices, the more individual birds just start kind of filling in this map a little bit. And to me, that's really strange, because why would you think like a bird of which there's only a few thousand, and there's only maybe a few hundred in any one area, and you tag, you wouldn't expect them to go to a place like Indonesia and then fan out thousands of miles individually, and sort of almost go dark on their own. You wouldn't think that. You would think they would actually congregate in certain areas. So this is really interesting. The other thing we found out, well, actually, this is kind of a funny anecdote, but this makes me think that, they're like truly like independent Alaskans, they just want to do their own thing. And I kept, in Indonesia, when I watched them, I kept having that same, if you watch their behavior, it was really weird, but they have that. They're a little aloof. They're kind of Alaskan in a lot of ways, But one of the most interesting things, is particularly with the geolocator tracking devices, this is kind of a simplistic map from one of our earlier publications, but it's just kind of the circles there kind of show you the wintering ranges off the coast of Sumatra. This is Krakatoa over here, Jakarta, the capital, and that's the Mentawai Islands, southwestern Sumatra. And so that's showing where a bird kind of went back to over 3 years. So this is the other remarkable thing to me, and this data are they're a little messy because they are geolocator, but basically these birds are going back to the same exact locations, more or less, the same wintering grounds in Indonesia, across an archipelago with 17,000 islands and endless coastline, from a place, from a variety of different locations in Alaska. But that's kind of interesting that a bird repeatedly goes back to these places. Why? Why would they go back to these same places? It doesn't really make sense, unless there's something about those places in particular that are special, that are unique, that are important for these birds. So that's what we're thinking. Okay, so what did I do? One of my personal challenges, beyond just sort of looking at the data and analyzing the data and mapping out the data, was actually quite a big one for me, and personally, was that I had to navigate the country across this big archipelago. I couldn't just hang out in Bali and surf the whole time, unfortunately, or I had to actually, I swear I didn't do that the whole time. And I had to basically disperse myself across the country and figure out how to get there, number one, across this archipelagic nation. And I had to get there from Bali, which, was pretty easy to get around, all things considered. And I had to get to some of the remotest parts of the archipelago, like Sumatra on the west there, Flores. The little circles are kind of the areas I ended up visiting across the archipelago, but they're not necessarily all places that tracked birds went to. I also visited some locations that some of the tracked birds that we had no evidence of that tracked birds went to, but there were some historical records that birds had been there, or there was some record or some database. because I wanted to kind of fill in some of these other gaps about whether Aleutian Turns were actually there. So my kind of challenge was, basically I had to navigate, I had to get to these areas and then find my way down to a local, dock or where a local group of fishermen were. And then I had to explain what the heck I was gonna do. So I didn't have Bahasa Indonesia language experience before I went, but I had to sort of pick it up on the fly, and also I got some training with the university I visited, or that hosted me, but it was tough. The conversation went something like this: "Selamat pergi." So this is me talking to a fisherman. "Morning, mas bro, you want surf? Want dive?" "Tidak, no, I don't want that, no. Saya mencari burung laut." "I'm looking for seabirds." "Huh? What?" "Tidak di sini, not here." Funny looks. So I kept asking around. It took me a few times to realize that burung means bird in Indonesia, but in slang, it means penis. So I was going down to the docks and asking for, well, use your imagination, right? So, yeah. So that was in any way, and bro, he'd say in perfect English, "If you want to get Nike Airs, why did you come all the way to Indonesia?" I was like, "Oh, right, I get it. Air Nike. Air Nike, yeah, right, high tide, you get the idea." So like there was all this, they basically played with my mind a lot. Actually, it was pretty amazing because they all spoke English, no matter where I went, because they all watch TV and they're all plugged in. The entire country of Indonesia is plugged in on this. They all WhatsApp each other. I have like 500 fishermen WhatsApp numbers on my phone, and they still, I'm not joking, they still send me videos, and they still, so I have a couple in particular that have sent me like videos of any bird they find on the water. It's amazing, but they were really, they were really accommodating. They had a lot of fun with me, and they actually, in the end, that's how I learned. I learned with taxi drivers and fishermen across that country. That was basically the best way to really get a vibe for what was going on. So Aleutian Turns a little bit in Indonesia. This is, on the top that's what Aleutian Turns look like in their breeding form, but then they go into Indonesian disguise on the bottom there. So they have a really prominent, they have this white mark on their forehead that is really distinguishing, but then they sort of lose that birds. It's common for these birds to go out of what are known as breeding molts. That breeding coloration has everything to do with mating behavior. And they lose that, and they go into non-breeding, and they go through intermediate stages. It gets much more complex. It's not just sort of happens over a few months. But the distinguishing characteristics for Aleutian Turns are what I call a trifecta, and it's very unique if you can catch it. And that is the mark, or rather the black bill, the black legs, and most importantly, what's known as the black secondary. So that's on the upper right there, the black secondary wings. A lot of pigment in that inside portion of the secondaries. And that's actually because the theory is that pigmentation is actually has something to do with the strength of those feathers in particular. So the colorations have some functional importance in terms of migratory behavior and how these birds fly and how they swim. And so it's not just an accident that they keep this pigmentation. It probably has something to do with the fact that they migrate, 10,000 miles and do these round trips. So they maintain that coloration pattern, except this is what you're faced with in Indonesia. This is just a sampling. This is just 6 of the local Indonesian species. You have to add in another 6, about 5 or 6 that occur throughout East Asia that are moving through. But so you have to kind of really pick them out and rely on those characteristics that I just pointed out. Most of these birds have 2 of those characteristics, but not the third, and so it's just a process of elimination. I'm not a birder, actually. I've never been a birder, full disclosure. I pose as one. There's people in this room who actually know are birders, so I need to be careful. But it's Juno. The way you do this is you get a telephoto lens and you basically start taking pictures. And so that's what you do. That's how you identify them. You take as many pictures of birds in flight, and digital photography is great. You can basically instantaneously almost figure out whether an Aleutian or a tern is an Aleutian tern by looking at these pictures almost in real time. So that's kind of real critical. How am I doing on time? Let me know how time. You doing okay? Okay. Where did these birds go to? I didn't always find Aleutian terns. By the time I got on the ground, as I said, often the satellite tags were kind of no longer functional. So I knew I was chasing behind terns, and I didn't expect to find terns necessarily. I knew that these are big areas, remote areas, and I guess I'll just leave it at that. But what do these areas look like? They were what we call ecologically diverse. You know, they weren't sort of unique. I mean, they might look all tropical to us, but they're very different. On the left, there's sort of a mangrove coastline, similar to what you find all around Bali and central Indonesia. And western Indonesia and Sumatra, you find these deep water areas, isolated islands, these islands that are kind of surrounded by deep water ocean currents. And also kind of classic coral reef environments like you find around Komodo National Park and Flores Island. If you've ever, I'm sure most of you heard of Komodo National Park, and many of you in Komodo dragons. So these are really biologically diverse coral reef habitats, and terns are found in all of these. Aleutian terns are found in all of these. And our tracked birds were found migrated to these areas. So again, the birds are pretty adaptive, apparently, because they go to these different areas, but they're also staying in these areas. So even though they're pretty diverse, they're also something productive or something important about each of these areas that theoretically these birds are prioritizing and they're migrating to. So one of the things that I also found was, I mean, everywhere I went, I found people. I think that goes without saying, but I found people that were really making a subsistence living, in particular, off of some sort of marine practice, and in particular, mariculture. There was a lot of this in Indonesia. There's a massive amount of mariculture. It's a huge industry there, and subsistence fishing. So on the left, on the upper left there are thousands of these fishing platforms, tens of thousands of fishing platforms, all on the coast, and people go out there at night, and they sort of like these floating platforms. They were kind of anchored, and you turn on lights and fish, and basically you get migration of phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then that drives fish, and you lower these fishing buckets, you know, and you basically haul up fish. And so this goes on like all over the place. It's a very, very traditional form of fishing there. And Aleutian Turn, or not Aleutian Turns, but terns in general, we go up to some of these platforms, and there'd be hundreds of terns on some of these platforms. So it was kind of hard. I have lots of information about all sorts of species of terns that use those platforms, basically because they're easy pickings. Lots of subsistence fishing on the left. Bottom on the center bottom there is emblematic of the massive aquarium trade, mariculture industry that exists there. So all sorts of these different ponds of like seahorses and things that end up in like probably Petco here or wherever, you know, through some trade, in some aquarium trade. And so these tropical fish, this is where they're coming from, a lot of them. And the upper right there is one of the most interesting ones, because it's often where I found, not often, but I found Aleutian terns there, and that's a pearl farm buoy. So Indonesia actually has a lock on the pearl farm globally. 70% of the pearls that are produced in the world come out of pearl farms come out of Indonesia right now. It's like a $30 billion industry for them, and so this is growing at a rapid pace. But terns like to kind of hang out. Aleutian terns like to hang out on these buoys. And again, it's this Alaskan independence, I swear. There's like, you never find Aleutian terns on the platforms that are up there. up on the upper left. You find every other species of terns on the upper left on those platforms, but you won't find Aleutian terns on those. Where you do find them, where there's just enough room for one bird on a buoy. I swear, and so they hang out there, and it's easy pickings for them. So, you know, like this is how things are in that part of the world, and this is what terns are experiencing, and they're optimizing, you know, any way they can get fish, and these kinds of things have been going on for a long time. So I want to kind of move a little bit to the lessons that I learned here as I kind of move towards closing this a little bit. Or at least I'll try to frame my findings in terms of these lessons. And so these are the lessons that I think this migratory seabird was teaching me and maybe teaching other people. So there's a heck of a lot we don't know. Basically, you know, when we started this project, well, I guess I should back up. It's like the fact that it's pretty stunning to me that in this day and age, you know, with technology and social media and all this emphasis on the environment, and even in Alaska, we tend to be pretty preoccupied, or we put a lot of emphasis on the environment and our local wildlife, and, you know, there's a lot of birders and everything, and this is still a total enigma. You know, before we started this, how did we miss this? How did we not know that there's this bird in Yakutat that's migrating 10,000 miles to, you know, uniquely to, well, no other species does this, to a place like Indonesia. So, so this is a real, actually Indonesia at large, and the role of Indonesia, and its 17,000 islands, and it's also holds 7 times more mangrove than any other country in the entire world. So it's a productive environment. What kind of value does it actually have? Even if you talk to Australians, when you look at their tracking data, and so these are typical things, you can find them online. They're like migratory routes for different birds. And most of what you see is they kind of come close to Indonesia, or even these maps show kind of arrows that kind of skip over Indonesia. They don't actually show them, you know, stopping in Indonesia. And that's because we don't know. I mean, I think it's sort of like we sort of know where these birds are caught. A lot of this comes from tagging, where you you tag a bird with a color band or a numbered band, and then you find them in a certain location. So it's hard to fit in the places in between, but basically Indonesia is a bit of a black box, and we still don't sort of understand its role, particularly in the East Asia, Australasia flyway. So that kind of goes from Japan and Eurasia all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. That's kind of a well-known flyway on the European side. This is the first time that we had really a North American species that is using that same flyway and actually staying in that area. Some birds move through, like bar-tailed godwits are another champion of migration. They go down to New Zealand and then kind of off the southeast coast of Australia, and then kind of work their way just close to Indonesia. But they're just kind of moving adjacent or through Indonesia, not actually stopping there. So the fact that Aleutian terns are there is pretty unique. So on one hand, that kind of says, you know, maybe we don't know very much, right? So maybe the millions of dollars we spent doing research, you know, hasn't been well spent. I don't know. It's not really millions of dollars, but it also says that there's kind of an unknown or unrecognized conservation value out there, right? We're just understanding this, what a place like Indonesia and its 17,000 islands, what sort of value it actually has. And I think that sort of mystery or that inspiration, the fact that there's still a lot to do, we could flip that on its head, and we could say, well, actually that's pretty inspiring. That means we don't know a lot, so there's a lot to do. Is the bird under threat? Is there any smoking gun in Indonesia on the flyaway somewhere that's related to these declines? I don't know. There's several intriguing flashpoints that are of concern on the flyway associated with their sources with East Asia and Australasia. This is a map of, it's kind of a little dark here, but it's showing you kind of the jurisdiction, the fishing jurisdiction that all these different countries claim in Southeast Asia. There's 40 countries that claim fishing grounds of varying degree all throughout Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. So unlike Alaska, where we basically have monopolized our fisheries, more or less, that part of the world is competing. You know, there's 40 different countries that are competing for fish in that area. In the upper left, in the East China Sea, that's one of these flashpoints that you've heard on the news about China, occupying these islands. So that's another flashpoint. Aleutian Turns are going right through these areas, literally right through these areas. The Luzon Strait is another one between China and Taiwan. And then those birds that I showed you earlier, I only showed you briefly, but they sort of fly to the Yellow Sea or inland in East Asia. That area has huge tidal wetlands that are all being churned up and all being developed because Asia, China in particular, and a lot of the countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, these are emerging giants, economic giants, and their coastlines are changing rapidly. And so they're modifying their coastlines, and these tidal wetlands are going away. So these are some of the things that are important, and that may be important stressors for these terns. I've talked about plastics already. That's sort of everywhere. It's in us. And so it could be affecting terns. And I don't need to show more pictures of dying birds in Alaska for us to know that there's some kind of smoking gun associated with the health of our marine food webs. Something is depleted. We already know that in the Indo-Pacific, in particular, they've seen a 7-fold decline in the volume of fish that's been pulled out of those countries. So a 700% decline based from something like the 1950s or 60s when you analyze. It's not great data, but we're fishing further and further up the food chain, and there's less and less food, basically. So. Okay, so what I would ask though, and this is one of the introspective things I came with. So the birds may be under threat, maybe not. There's some reason to be concerned, but what I had to ask myself is, does it really matter? I mean, isn't it enough that this majestic bird, it's relatively uncommon. It travels 30,000 kilometers every year between two remarkable places, Alaska and Indonesia. Like, that is an awesome story. What do we need threats for? What do we need to say that this bird is under trouble? And so I think like the bird is kind of, I'm a conservation biologist, and we tend to think in that way. If there's and in the environmental community, we tend to think that way. If it's not under threat, right, then what are we worried about? But we need this threat. We need this trigger for us to be concerned about it. But I think this bird is speaking out to the conservation community, us in general. I think we've kind of backed up conservation and environmentalism into this corner, and we need this trigger, or we need to feel like there's a threat for us to like suddenly make something important. And you want to know what? I don't think we do with something like this. That's what I think. I think this is a great story. I think we can say, hey, who cares if the bird's declining? This is something worth fighting for. This is really uncommon, right? It says a lot about the value of Alaska. It says a lot about the value of a place like Indonesia. So I think actually terns could actually be a shining example, Aleutian terns, about how we can adapt, how we can be resilient. Not everything has to be about how dire things are. And so maybe this is a species we should be learning from. This is a bird that obviously is adapting. Kind of on that same note, my other lesson here is that kind of made me realize that this whole business of the Anthropocene, of which even I've written about, is what I call kind of new Western mythology to some degree. I can see Kevin, he's gonna laugh back there. He's teaching a class on mythology, or the Anthropocene right now, so this is gonna be a good debate. But it kind of made me think, for Alaska and Alaskans, we kind of forget, like, that there's something, that the idea of something other than, the Anthropocene is like some kind of luxury. Like, it's a very luxurious, thing that we can even say that, this idea of the Anthropocene is something new, really. But, for the rest of the world, it's really not. I'm guilty of myself that. This is on the left there, that's the Malacca Strait. 3/4 of the Aleutian Turns are moving through that area. That's off the coast of Singapore. That's the second biggest shipping port in the world, next to Hong Kong. And actually, Aleutian Turns move through Hong Kong as well. So those two shipping ports, that's what it looks like. There's Aleutian Turns from the wilds of Alaska moving through areas like that. And as far as we know, that's kind of how it's always been to some degree. I'm not saying it's not changing, but people are these birds are definitely occupying areas that are definitely have been living with humans and these kinds of situations and these kinds of contexts for a long time. On the right is the Singapore coastline, and everything in that is entirely constructed. That's an entirely human, the entire country of actually Singapore, and I don't mean that in a critical way, is like extremely well manicured and planned and fabricated. Almost the entire country, and that's what Singapore looks like. And terns are moving through there. That is a human, heavily human modified, even though it's aesthetically pleasing, but it's a human modified landscape, and terns are moving right through. So what do we do with that? Does that mean, it's futile, like terns are like destined, for dire consequences as these places change? I guess I would say no. I would say, contrary to our Western values about like wilderness and how, the role of humans in inevitable threats that development poses, maybe this is just another opportunity that we've been missing. Again, Aleutian terns are this idea that there's species out there that are really resilient, that have been around humans for a long time, that have been adapting. Those are the kind of things that maybe we should be looking at. We should be holding up a little bit more than we do. That includes even species in our backyard. That include ravens, right? I mean, these are species that have been with us for a long time, and there's many examples of that. And those are, just because they're not under dire threat in some way, it doesn't mean they're not important. So I think this is, again, a message that maybe we need to think a little more about conservation. Well, that the conservation community really needs to think about in particular. And while it's true, so I guess there's also a bit of like colonial thinking when it comes to conservation, that like these countries aren't really doing anything. All they're doing is developing and whatnot, and they're these giant economic, powerhouses, but that's really not true at all. It's not even remotely true. China is, for instance, you don't hear about the news, is putting hundreds of millions of dollars into conservation and is going through a green revolution in terms of energy. They're on it. And most of East Asia and Singapore is the entire, most of Southeast Asia, they're thinking about these things. And they're also thinking about conservation. It's starting to be part of their concerns on a daily level. They know about plastics in the ocean. They're concerned about the health of the ocean. Everybody I talk to is, it's out in the media, they're on the media, they see it. And so this is a good example of just one small piece in Indonesia. This is the Riau archipelago, kind of northeastern Sumatra, again, between Sumatra and Singapore, in the bottom left there. And all those different lines around those islands and whatnot are just different conservation areas have been set aside. That big rectangle is something called a marine protected area. There's many marine protected areas that are going up left and right in different places of Indonesia to protect resources and to protect a lot of the services like fish and whatnot, ecosystem services that are associated with those areas. But what I've kind of superimposed in there are all the turn locations for one individual. So that's those little dots there are Aleutian Turns, one individual, just kind of moving in and out of those marine protected areas and into these national parks and into these different islands. So these conservation areas, like together, they have a lot of value. And so the message moving forward, what I tried to work with Indonesians on is really thinking about some of this a little bigger. And that's what I'm hoping to do with them moving forward, is that, well, they're starting to get conservation minded, but now is the time to think about maybe networking these into something bigger. They don't have something like Aleutian Turns to evaluate this against. So this was really useful for them. This says to them that, hey, we're putting in these conservation areas, and it has a lot of conservation value, not just for us, but you guys around the globe too. So this is just one small example. And this is the Riau archipelago. It's actually a nice area. We're hoping to kind of about half the birds that we've tracked have actually gone through this area, and also have wintered there. And so I'm hoping that this is where we take some of the research and we start some research with Indonesians and maybe try some of the reverse moving forward. So stay tuned on that. I'm gonna skip this for time, but okay, so another good lesson, maybe my sort of final lesson is the power of a good story. So even though I've been studying terns and writing grants and writing scientific publications and working with agency people, and we're trying to count how many terns there are, and we're having a lot of trouble, I had this epiphany that, you know what? Probably the best thing I could possibly do is to keep just talking about this story to everyone I can get. And I had this realization because I had all these interactions with Indonesians. On the left there, that's Wayan. He's a taxi driver in Sumatra that I met. And I told him about this, and he started driving me everywhere, and he helped me, basically. And you know, he spent 3 days with me, and basically, he was really emotional about this because he was so overtaken. I told him the story about terns. He didn't know about this, and it made him really, what he said, he turned to me and he said, it makes me really proud. I had no idea that this was happening. And he's just somebody who speaks really good English because he watches Alaska trucker highways or whatever that is. So he knows all about Alaska. He's actually an engineer. He has an engineering degree, but he's driving a taxi. It's Indonesian, right? And so, but it was just, you know, that's the kind of thing that happened there over and over again. All the jukung operators or the outrigger canoe people I talked to, every single one of them, you know, when I told them this, their eyes just lit up. This was like a source of pride for them, the fact that like someone had come there and told them this story, and that now they know that this bird and Indonesian is playing this role. Not a lot of people have told them this. A lot of people, what they do here is, why are you tearing down your trees? That's what they hear from the West, right? That's what we tell Indonesia. Why is your tropical rainforest disappearing? What are you doing to your coral reefs? But no one ever says, hey, you guys, you know, you have something special here, and you know, and it's important, and it's a source of pride for them. Upper right is a coastal cleanup crew we worked with. So there's a lot of people, a lot of groups starting to get proactive about coastal cleanup and plastics, and they're cleaning up these plastics, and they don't know, well, they know why they're doing it for the plastics, but link in the story of terns and seabirds coming from halfway around the world, and suddenly picking up plastics becomes a lot more important. So that was really fun working with these groups. And then held lots of workshops. This is actually a funny one. People got wind that I was around and started inviting me to do outreach and whatnot, and that is everywhere I went. Indonesians they love optics, and so they'd create these giant banners. You know, it's kind of intimidating, and like, you know, Sanjay Pyare is going to be doing this, and like, you know, and it's like, wow, like holy cow. So they create print these giant banners, and then so that's the president. That's up above me there on the upper right, Jokowi. And that is an Aleutian Turn, you know, that now have superimposed on all their banners. And so everywhere you went, there's this Aleutian Turn, you know, that showed up, and no one really knew like what this bird was until I started, but I thought it was just funny, you know. So again, the power of a good story was enough. That was enough to set something in motion, I think. So that resulted in a few other things. We did that led to a whole workshop where we got out of just thinking about migratory birds and this idea of, well, where are these birds going to? And what's the situation, how much conservation planning is going on around where these birds are going to, and what other important socioeconomic values can you get out of these other areas? So we held a workshop. I held a workshop with a national park there and at a university, and it was a 4-day workshop. It was great, students, and it was in West Bali National Park. We actually did 2 rounds of that, and that was great, where we basically, I taught them how to map, and we did some coastal conservation planning exercises. So led to a World Migratory Bird Day, several of those events there, where we took people out and looked for migratory birds and local birds. So there's lots of sort of on the ground kinds of activities. And then finally, this is kind of one of my what I hope we're moving forward. So we started this Migratory Bird Fund for Indonesian students to basically do research. So I started this with a faculty member at Udayana University. Uni, she's probably out there. Hey, Uni. And we're hoping to kind of, basically, the idea is not for me to do the research anymore, it's for Indonesia to do the research. And so somehow figure out a way that we can get resources there and build capacity there to do the reverse rather than me. Although I do want to keep going to Indonesia, but, all right, so I kind of started this journey in kind of the classic sense of a biologist and this mindset as a conservationist, and just trying to find out information. But I think kind of what I found, my takeaway is what I found is I found something very different. It changed me. It made me really think about what I had been thinking, you know, my mindset about conservation and environmentalism. And it made me really think hard about people and the role of people. You know, we immediately say Asia, right? And everybody thinks, oh God, people, right? You know, 3 billion people. But I tell you what, like when you're on the ground there, people are motivated there too. There's a lot of capacity there to, not just to build buildings, but to do good work too. And so I felt, I came away with a strong feeling that, hey, if you could put this in motion, if you could help, you know, people think conservation-mindedly, and they already are, but promote that, then you could do way more than you could, than, you know, continuing to do your research in the US, really. And so, so it's kind of shifting me moving forward, and that's where I want to go with this moving forward. So I'm going to end it at that. And then I guess I'll take questions if there's time. Any questions?
Sanjay, did you think about other birds besides the Arctic tern, or exactly, can you pinpoint why you picked the Arctic tern?
I picked it was the Aleutian Turn. I picked it because, you know, because it was not well understood. It was a little, to me, it's a little bit of a diamond in the rough, right? It's relatively uncommon. We don't know much about it. And there's only, how many? 10, 15,000? Like, ever? Shouldn't we know something more about this? What happens if half of them are wiped out by some hurricane event or cyclone or something? I don't know. So these kinds of, that was what's been going into my mind. It was also fortuitous because I worked in Yakutat. I spend a lot of time there, and so I know people there. I've been working with them on other projects, and it led to this. And so, we thought they were going to go south. We had no idea that they were going to go, you know, to Indonesia. So it was, that was why we picked it. You know, it's locally relevant too.
Just a point of clarification. Earlier in the lecture, you talked about the birds blinking out. Does that mean they weren't dying, right? They were just leaving early and you don't know where they went? Or I was just curious more about that.
Yeah, I guess I said that a couple of times. There were several large breeding colonies that, and for the last couple of decades, yeah, they've just blinked out. Birds don't breed there anymore. The Copper River Delta, or I shouldn't say you don't, but it's nothing like it used to be. Several thousand birds, maybe a handful of 20 birds, 50 birds, 100 birds show up to those areas. Kodiak as well. Yeah, they're not coming back. We don't know, yeah, those are different birds, but for some reason that shut off there. The other thing was in Yakutat in particular, in some years when we tried to monitor nests, the colony was abandoned mid-season, and so even with eggs still in the nests in some cases. So we don't know what's going on there. So those are two different, I think I said that under, so not dead birds, but not great either, so. Yeah, Bob.
How much do we know about Aleutian Turns on the Asian side, Russia, Kamchatka Peninsula, and so forth?
Yeah. So I didn't put up that map, actually. And so when we did the first study using the geolocator tracking technology, the first place I went and looked was how close are they migrating to those. I actually called a Russian, got hold of, through a network with somebody here who knew a Russian biologist there, Yuri. And I was able to correspond with them, and we asked them, and we said, so are those birds still on the ground? Like, were they on the ground at this time? And Aleutian Turns are migrating through those areas in early August, and Siberian birds are just starting to fledge at that time. And so I mean, not exactly, but if I showed you a map in the global sense, it's pretty close. But you know, they're within a few hundred kilometers. You know, they're right on the flyway. They go to that same. They're using that same area, the Sea of Japan. So we still don't know what the relationship is. Maybe some of those birds. It's never been documented, as far as I know. Actually, you would tell me better. Now, I mean, whether eastern and western hemisphere birds, you know, whether they're commingling or not. It's really rare. It's uncommon to find that kind of a thing. They do commingle on wintering grounds sometimes. We find that, we know that, but they tend not to, you know, switch, you know, breeding areas or something like that. So there's definitely something we don't know. Some biologists, Alaskan biologists, got to Russia last year, and so I'm not sure what they found. They counted, because there's not great data there either. It's huge. We think Alaska's huge. Go there, it's 10 Alaskas. And so they went there to kind of ascertain how many Aleutian terns are actually there.
Did you find any other names for the bird in these other countries? I assume Aleutian is distinct to here, but
yeah, that brings up. I had another lesson that was up there that I took out, and that is, you know, just how colonial thinking, you know, how colonial thinking is about this stuff, right? The bird is an Aleutian tern. It's an Indonesian bird. It's in Indonesia for 9 months. We should rename the bird, right? And so, no, because it goes into disguise. It goes into Indonesian disguise. And that's what I said, like, it's really hard. If you don't know what you're looking for, I don't know how an Indonesian birder, no matter how good they are, would have known that they're looking at Aleutian terns. The only people that, you know, really do this stuff are total bird nerds, right? I mean, you know, and there's probably like 30, you know, who would even bother to do such a thing, you know, but it's not really well known. So there's not really, there is one thing, what do they call it? There was a term, I don't know, I saw it somewhere, it was pollution tern. Was a name, was referenced to in Hong Kong. And it's because, again, Aleutian terns, they have this unique behavior. They're singular, they like to land on things individually. So they rarely land, you know, on the open ocean, but when they do, they tend to land on these little floating flotsam. And so they're often seen like floating on some, you know, in East Asia, like on some little piece of styrofoam or some little garbage thing. And so that's the pollution thing. But I actually think that's fairly important, because I think that's really common for them to do. Like that's a behavioral thing. They're not like found near seeking out pollution or anything like that. But that was one of the, in Hong Kong, I guess, like that's what one of the terns one of the references that they refer to Aleutian terns as. So as they move through, that's when they see them. All right, I think that's about it. Thanks.